Some truths are so dangerous, they must be buried deeper than any body. This story begins in a cold corner of London, where a Czech nobleman arrives with a cryptic symbol and a vanished companion, setting in motion a web of forged manuscripts, secret dynasties, and a ghost who refuses to stay hidden. Where are you tuning in from? And what time is it there? Let me know in the comments. The shadows are waiting, the names have been forgotten, so let us follow Holmes into the silence history tried to erase. It was upon a damp and wind-scoured evening in late November that I found myself once more by the hearth of our familiar lodgings at 221B Baker Street, with the chill fog of London pressing against the window panes like a living thing. The lamps outside cast dim halos upon the glass, refracted by droplets that clung like dew to a crypt-keeper's gate. Holmes, wrapped in his dressing gown and seated cross-legged upon the settee, had maintained an unnatural silence for nearly an hour. His long, pale fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half-shuttered, as though communing with some unseen adversary. I too refrained from breaking the quiet, for I had come to recognize such moods in him. They signified either the tail end of a recent case or the foretaste of one yet to arrive. I suspected the latter, for he had spent the previous day in such a state of listless abstraction that even his violin lay untouched. "There is a curious heaviness to the air tonight," I ventured at last. Holmes did not stir. "The city is holding its breath, Watson." I might have pressed him for elaboration when a firm and unfamiliar rap struck the door below. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson's footsteps echoed upon the stair, followed by her genteel knock. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she announced. "He says the matter admits of no delay." Holmes's eyes flicked open. "Show him in," he said, and then added, more to himself than to me, "The stage, it seems, is at last prepared." The man who stepped into our sitting room had the bearing of one accustomed to formality, though his expression betrayed the weight of recent agitation. He was tall and thin, perhaps in his early 40s, with features sharply drawn, as though etched by the rigours of exile or disease. His frock coat, though impeccably cut, bore the faint trace of rain across the shoulders, and he clutched his gloves in one hand with nervous compulsion. A neatly trimmed beard framed a mouth pressed tightly shut beneath hollow cheeks, and his eyes, dark and deeply set, regarded Holmes with a curious blend of suspicion and relief. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, his accent tinged unmistakably with the clipped cadences of Central Europe. "I am," Holmes replied, motioning him to the chair opposite. "And this is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson. May I ask your name and the nature of your distress?" "I am Count Emil Dvorak," the man said, lowering himself slowly into the offered seat. "A Bohemian by birth, though the term, I fear, has lost its sovereign clarity in recent years." "Indeed," Holmes murmured, his gaze narrowing slightly. "I have come regarding a disappearance," Dvorak continued. "A dear associate of mine, a linguist and countryman named Dr. Vaclav Stransky, vanished 2 nights ago from his lodging in Bloomsbury. No word, no warning, and no trace left behind, save for an envelope beneath his pillow." "What sort of envelope?" Holmes asked quietly. Dvorak withdrew a folded sheet from his inner coat. "Inside was this," he said, handing it to Holmes. "A drawing of a lion, but one that wears no crown." Holmes examined it for no more than a moment before speaking. "Ah," he said softly, "the ghost from Prague brings with him a heraldry of silence." At Holmes's invitation, Count Dvorak leaned forward, his voice low and modulated, though scarcely concealing the tension behind it. "Dr. Stransky and I have known each other since our youth in Prague," he began. "In recent years, exile has made us closer still. He was residing in modest rooms on Calthorpe Street, under the name Janek, and though discreet by nature, he was not a man given to sudden absences." "And yet he has vanished," said Holmes quietly. 2 nights past, the Count confirmed. I had expected him at our usual meeting near Russell Square. He failed to appear. When I called upon him the following morning, his landlady informed me that he had not returned. His belongings were untouched, his correspondence uncollected, and no message left behind. No mention of travel, illness, I asked. None, nor had he any known enemies in London. But, Dvorak paused, he did possess knowledge that might be dangerous in the wrong hands. Holmes raised an eyebrow. You speak of political knowledge. Historical, the Count replied. But in our part of Europe, the two are seldom separate. Holmes steepled his fingers once more. And the drawing, this lion robbed of its crown, was found where, precisely? Under his pillow, Dvorak replied. Placed there, I believe, as a message. Indeed, murmured Holmes. A silent emblem, and one few would understand. The truth is, Mr. Holmes, continued the Count, after a moment's hesitation, Dr. Stransky and I had recently come into possession of a manuscript of exceptional antiquity and, how shall I say it, seditious potential. Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly. Ah, now we begin to see the outline of the ghost. The document, said Dvorak, is a genealogical record, a collection of claims from the reign of Ferdinand V, compiled by a monk of the Premonstratensian order. It purports to prove the illegitimacy of a senior branch of the Habsburg line by way of a misattributed birth during the Revolution of 1848. A bold assertion, said Holmes, and one not likely to earn you many friends in Vienna. Nor in London, added Dvorak. The manuscript was meant for private translation and authentication. But Stransky began to suspect we were being watched. He believed someone, perhaps from the Austrian legation, had learnt of its existence. Was it ever published? I asked. No, nor should it be. We kept it under lock and key, hidden within a volume of poetry. Then I presume your friend disappeared not merely as a victim, but as a custodian, Holmes said. Whoever took him desired not the man, but what he carried. Count Dvorak's lips tightened. I believe so, and I fear that should the document fall into the wrong hands, it will not be Stransky alone who suffers for it. Holmes turned again to the scrap of paper the Count had provided, holding it between two fingers as though it might dissolve under the pressure of thought. The ink was thick and crude, the image little more than a hastily rendered sketch. But its implication, I saw, was not lost on my friend. A lion without a crown, he murmured. A nation without a sovereign. The Bohemian coat of arms undone. You recognize the symbolism? Asked Dvorak. Of course, but it is not merely symbolic. It is a warning, almost a curse. It implies a stripping of legitimacy, a rebuke to empire. More dangerously still, it implies knowledge behind the rebuke. He passed the paper to me. Note the angle of the claw, Watson. Whoever drew this knew the heraldic form, but altered it deliberately. This is no schoolboy's fancy. It is a signal, issued from one initiate to another. Then the symbol alone carries meaning? I asked. In the right circles, said Holmes. It speaks more loudly than words, and it suggests that your missing doctor may have stepped deeper into forbidden waters than even he realized. For a moment, Holmes said nothing further. He rose from his chair and crossed to the fire, standing with his back to us, the fingers of one hand resting upon the mantel as he gazed into the flames. Then, as if struck by some inner alignment of logic, he turned sharply. You have the address of Dr. Stransky's lodgings? Yes, said the Count, rising. I can provide it at once. Good. We shall call there tomorrow morning. Dr. Watson, if you are at liberty? Entirely, I said. Holmes inclined his head. Then let us begin at the place where all things have been left untouched. For if there is any shadow remaining of Dr. Stransky, it shall linger there. He looked again at the strange drawing, now resting on the table between us. When a ghost crosses from the continent to our streets, he said, more to himself than to us, it seldom comes empty-handed, Watson, but the hand it extends may hold either a truth or a dagger. And with that final word, the silence in the room became colder still. It was under a grey and reluctant dawn that Holmes and I found ourselves in the vicinity of Calthorpe Street, the air thick with the bitter smell of coal and the echo of milk carts upon slick flagstones. The address provided by Count Dvorak brought us to a narrow lodging house of brick and age-stained lace curtains, unremarkable in appearance yet, as Holmes would often remind me, no setting is ever neutral in its narrative. Mrs. Ellen Pike, a widow of stern propriety and close-guarded suspicion, answered our knock with a look that bespoke both curiosity and weariness. She admitted us with some reluctance, evidently under the impression that our visit pertained to rent arrears or scandal. Holmes presented his card and offered a plausible pretext involving Dr. Stransky's correspondence with a scientific journal. "I don't meddle in the affairs of foreign tenants," she said tersely. "He paid regular and was always quiet." The room itself, situated on the upper floor, bore no sign of recent disturbance. A suitcase rested near the wardrobe, unopened. A coat still hung on the peg. The bed was unmade, yet the sheets retained no impression of a night's sleep. The air was neither stale nor freshly disturbed, but hung with that particular stillness which one encounters in rooms left abruptly. Holmes said nothing at first. He walked the perimeter slowly, his gaze flitting over scuff marks, corners of paper, the bent edge of a chair leg. I knew that in such silences, deductions were already forming. "A departure," he said at last, "but not a flight. There was no haste, only intent." At Holmes's bidding, Mrs. Pike was summoned again and asked to recount the last known moments of her tenant's presence. She folded her arms, clearly uncomfortable with the line of questioning, but obliged. "It was late, near 2 in the morning," she began. "I keep odd hours, being light of sleep. I heard footsteps on the stairs, soft, but not unfamiliar. He was always a quiet one, Dr. Stransky. I opened my door a crack, just in time to see him enter his room. Did he appear unwell?" I asked. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Pale, as if he'd seen a ghost, and slower than usual, like his limbs were carrying more than just his coat. He looked back over his shoulder before closing the door, but not at me, at the stairwell behind him." "Did he speak?" Holmes asked. "Only to himself, and not in English," she replied. "A whisper, almost like a prayer, or a warning. Then, not 10 minutes later, I heard the door again. This time, it was quieter, too quiet. I waited, listened, but there was no sound of boots, no slam of the outer door, just the air changing." "Changing?" Holmes repeated. "I can't describe it better," she said. "It was as if something had been removed from the house, something living. When I checked in the morning, he was gone." Holmes regarded her a moment. "You have a sensitive ear, Mrs. Pike," he said, "and perhaps a rarer gift, the memory of silence." Holmes remained in the room long after Mrs. Pike had excused herself, moving now with greater deliberation. I observed him kneel beside the writing desk and retrieve a crumpled piece of paper from the waste bin, a torn sheet, partially scorched at one edge. "This, Watson, is the ghost's true footprint," he murmured, turning the scrap over in his fingers. "Note the faint lines across the surface, horizontal ruling, and something more subtle beneath." I took it from him and squinted under the window light. "A watermark?" "Precisely, but not one you or I would encounter in our usual commerce. It is the emblem of a press once active in Moravia, a small clandestine operation in the village of Prosterhof, disbanded some 15 years ago. Their paper was used exclusively for pamphlets issued by the so-called Vltava Circle." I looked up. "The Revolutionary Society?" "The very same. Their activities were suppressed, brutally, some would say, and most of their printed works destroyed. That such paper should find its way here suggests not only purpose, but preservation. But this tells us that Stransky had been handling such material, or someone wanted us to believe he had." Holmes's eyes narrowed. The edges are singed, but the flame did not consume. Someone lit it, and then changed his mind. He slipped the paper into his pocketbook with care. The past has long arms, Watson, and it appears they have reached as far as Bloomsbury. From Calthorpe Street we made our way westward, crossing through the bustle of Gray's Inn and into Fitzrovia's quieter lanes, until we reached a discreet, two-storey building bearing no sign, save for a brass lion's head above the lintel. It was the Bohemian Club, an unassuming haunt known to harbour displaced intellectuals, political exiles, and the occasional disillusioned noble. I had passed it 100 times without taking notice. Holmes, however, stepped within as though returning to a familiar chessboard. We were admitted by a pale young man whose accent marked him as Viennese, and led to a narrow chamber panelled in dark wood, and populated by men whose murmured discussions ceased at our entrance. A haze of pipe smoke lingered about the ceiling, and in the dimness I recognised not a single familiar face. Holmes presented no credentials. He merely asked for news of Dr. Stransky. The effect was subtle but undeniable. One man lowered his newspaper without turning the page. Another stirred his brandy twice, and then did not drink. A third, a florid fellow with ink-stained cuffs, glanced once at Holmes, and then resumed an article that he had evidently not been reading. "I take it the good doctor is not among you," Holmes said lightly. "Nor is the Count, I presume." There was no answer. "Then perhaps," he added, his tone still conversational, "someone here has seen the manuscript, or has reason to believe it has crossed dangerous borders." It was then that the man at the far end, tall, gaunt, with a silver-tipped cane, rose without a word and departed through the rear door. Holmes smiled faintly. "Suspicion, Watson, is often the first step toward confession, especially among those who have something to lose." It was in the corridor outside that Holmes was approached by a figure I had not noticed before, a man of uncertain age, with thin spectacles and the habitual stoop of a scholar. He looked nervously about before addressing Holmes in a low and rapid tone. "I would advise you to tread carefully, sir," he said. "Dr. Stransky was not liked, even by those who agreed with him." "Not liked," Holmes repeated. "He asked too many questions, spoke of truths best buried. There are names that ought not be revived, bloodlines, histories." "You believe his disappearance was political?" "I believe," the man whispered, "that some knowledge poisons the one who bears it. There are relics of our past that the present dares not touch. Do not ask them to speak. They remember their own silence." "Is the manuscript real?" The man's lips tightened. "Real enough to make enemies. Real enough to make men disappear." "And the Count?" "I will say nothing of him." "Then why speak at all?" Holmes asked gently. The man's eyes searched the shadows. "Because I saw the mark." "What mark?" "The lion without a crown," he murmured, and turned quickly down the stairs, vanishing before we could detain him. We walked in silence some distance from the club before Holmes spoke again. When he did, his words were measured and low. "Watson, what do we make of a man who brings us a puzzle whose pieces he himself has selected? You suspect Count Dvorak." "I do not suspect," Holmes said. "I observe, and I observe a man who arrived at our door with urgency, yet with every detail in readiness. A man who claims friendship, yet offers no emotion beyond what is required. A man who produces a clue that requires us to seek answers only in the places he prefers. You think he planted the drawing? I think he allowed it to be found. There is a subtle difference. The clue was meant to alarm us, but not too much. It was calculated to provoke investigation, but only in a direction of his choosing." I frowned. "But if Dvorak is our adversary, why involve us at all?" "Because, my dear fellow, he wishes to control the narrative. We are the stage he needs. The story must unfold, yes, but only as he directs it." He looked up as the bells of St. George's struck the hour. "Until now, Watson, I have chased a ghost. I believe it is time to study the puppet master." That evening, As the lamps had been lit and Holmes sat once more in his familiar chair with his violin across his knees, Mrs. Hudson brought in the final post. Among the mundane envelopes and circulars was a single, pale letter without stamp or seal. Holmes examined it with a gloved hand and slit it open with his penknife. He read it once, then handed it to me, without comment. The message within was brief, written in an angular foreign hand. He who opens the lion's mouth will lose his tongue. There was no signature. I looked at Holmes. A warning? Or an invitation? He said. His voice was calm, but I noted the faint tightening at the corner of his mouth. He tossed the letter into the fire, where it curled and blackened without scent. There is a certain elegance to veiled threats, he remarked. They serve both as intimidation and confirmation. Confirmation of what? That we are not merely chasing shadows, Watson. We are being watched, and whoever watches us believes we are dangerously close to truth. I felt the weight of the words settle in the air. Holmes placed his violin aside. Tomorrow, he said quietly, we shall pay a visit to my brother. The following morning found us seated in the austere silence of the Diogenes Club, where decorum, reticence, and discretion reign supreme. Few in London would have guessed that behind one of those impassive chairs sat a man whose knowledge of European affairs exceeded that of any cabinet minister, and fewer still would know that this man, Mycroft Holmes, was brother to my friend. Holmes had scribbled a cryptic message the previous evening, and by some quiet string of influence, we had been granted audience. I assume, Sherlock, said Mycroft, without rising from his chair, that this matter of yours has ceased to be academic. It now bears teeth, Holmes replied, lowering himself beside him. Mycroft gave a small, dry smile. The name Vaclav Stransky came across a Foreign Office desk 2 weeks ago, a minor figure of interest, former professor of comparative linguistics, dismissed from Charles University in Prague for radical affiliations. Watched? Loosely, Mycroft admitted. He kept to himself. But his name is tied to a parcel that crossed from Brno to London last month. The parcel, we suspect, contained a manuscript of genealogical nature, likely fabricated, but in the hands of the right or wrong person, such a document could be weaponized. Was Count Dvorak named? Mycroft's brow furrowed. He was not, but his presence now places him under suspicion. Dvorak's credentials are valid, but that proves nothing. The Austrians have an interest in discrediting Stransky, but someone else appears interested in silencing him. And the lion without its crown? Holmes asked quietly. Mycroft gave a rare pause. That symbol, he said, has not been seen in diplomatic circles since the dissolution of the Vltava Circle. I had heard the name but vaguely, a murmur in the papers a decade past, associated with insurrections and pamphlets seized at midnight raids across Bohemia and Moravia. But Holmes, as always, required no elaboration. The Vltava Circle, he repeated. I had presumed them dead. Dead in the legal sense, yes, said Mycroft. But a few members remained in exile. Dissidents, monarchists, scholars who believed the true royal lineage of Bohemia had been buried in favour of Habsburg utility. Their method was not violence, but revelation, documents, letters, birth records, all couched in ciphers and hidden within false texts. Holmes nodded. And they believed such a record could restore Bohemia's autonomy. Mycroft allowed himself the smallest shrug. Perhaps, but Britain has little appetite for entertaining such ghosts. The Austrians, however, would see it as an existential threat. And the watermark, Holmes prompted. Mycroft steepled his fingers. You have seen it then? That press was used only once, on a volume entitled Rex Bohemia. It disappeared following the arrest of a Jesuit printer in 1874. The plates were thought destroyed. But someone found them, Holmes murmured, or forged them closely enough. In either case, said Mycroft, whoever possesses that document now holds a blade to Vienna's throat, and perhaps to Prague's heart as well. Holmes said nothing. His gaze had fixed upon some distant point of logic beyond my reach, and I knew the next move in our pursuit had been chosen. It was not yet midday when we found ourselves on a quieter lane near Lambeth, at the modest storefront of Lisker & Sons antiquarian booksellers. The bell above the door jingled with reluctant charm, and a moment later a hunched figure emerged from behind a stack of folios, blinking through pince-nez and clutching a ledger. "You are Mr. Lisker?" Holmes inquired gently. "Yes," he said, his accent bohemian and his manner cautious. "What is it you seek?" Holmes produced his card and mentioned the name of Dr. Stransky. The effect was immediate. Lisker's lips parted but did not speak. He glanced behind him, as though suspecting listeners even in the shadows of his own establishment. "I have not seen him," he said. "Not since last week." "But you spoke with him?" Lisker nodded once. "He came looking for a volume, a rare one. He said it had been sent, smuggled really, from Brno. He asked about bindings. He said it would be disguised." Holmes leaned slightly forward. "Did he find it?" "No," said Lisker. "But I believe he feared someone else had. He left me with a warning." "What kind of warning?" "That the lion would roar once more, and that I should remember the name Janek, should anything happen." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Do you have the book?" Lisker hesitated, then drew a small, unmarked codex from beneath the counter. Holmes opened it, turning the pages slowly until he reached the centre, where faint ink bled through a pasted sheet. There, beneath a layer of false scripture, lay a single phrase in Latin and a date, Prague, 1848. Beneath it, a name, and a smear of a dried brown across the lower corner. "Watson," Holmes said, "this is no longer a question of politics. It is one of blood." Holmes had long taught me that truth in documents resides not only in the words inscribed, but in those deliberately concealed. And it was in that spirit that he examined the codex Lisker had surrendered. "It is not the pages themselves," he murmured, "but the bones beneath." He applied a chemical solution he carried for precisely such purposes, and under its influence the paper, once blank, began to offer secrets. Faint lines of Latin text emerged, names, dates, relationships, charting a genealogical chain that bore little resemblance to the accepted royal succession. One entry, particularly, caught Holmes's eye, a reference to a child born in secret at the Capuchin convent in Prague, registered beneath a fabricated name and passed to a merchant family. Below this, however, came a more chilling detail, a signature, written in a darker fluid, less precise than ink, and jagged in its descent across the margin. Holmes frowned. "The name is genuine," he said, "but the manner of writing suggests haste, possibly fear. The stain itself." "Blood?" I asked. He did not answer immediately. "A deliberate gesture, I think. Not merely a mark, but a sacrifice." "What does it signify?" "That someone believed so fiercely in this lineage that they sealed it with their own body. And if this lineage is true, Watson, it threatens more than a single family. It threatens a dynasty. And so, men kill for it." "Not for the truth, my friend," Holmes replied, "but for what the truth might undo." The following morning, we returned to Lambeth in the hope of clarifying a passage from the Codex later pages. Yet as we approached Lisker & Sons, we were met not with the musty scent of books, but with the sharp tang of splintered wood and violence. The front window had been shattered, the door hung askew. Inside, the shop bore signs of ferocious intrusion. Shelves had been upended, volumes scattered, drawers pried loose, and in the far corner, a bloodied ledger lay beside a pair of broken spectacles. A constable was stationed just outside, and upon recognising Holmes, admitted us with sombre reluctance. "Burgled last night," he said. "No sign of forced entry round the back. Looks like someone had a key, or knew how to turn one." "And Mr. Lisker?" Holmes asked. "Gone, vanished, not a trace. But the lad who worked here, his assistant, was found unconscious, head wound, won't speak. We found the young man in the back room, attended by a constable's wife. His eyes fluttered open only once, and then closed again with a wince. Holmes examined the pattern of disturbance. They were not searching randomly, he said. They came for one thing, and found it. The book? I asked. Perhaps. Or what followed it? He turned back to the constable. If Liska reappears, alert me at once. But I fear, Watson, he added as we stepped into the street, that Mr. Liska has entered a silence from which few return. We had scarcely returned to Baker Street when a messenger arrived bearing a note in trembling script from Count Dvorak's hotel. The words were few: come at once, urgent, poison. Within the hour, we were at the modest establishment in Russell Square. The Count lay propped against the pillows of his bed, his complexion waxen and his breath shallow. A decanter of wine rested untouched upon the sideboard, beside which Holmes found a glass, its residue tinged with the faint hue of laudanum or some other agent. Holmes sniffed the liquid, dipped a finger, and then nodded grimly. Not intended to kill, he said. Merely to confuse, slow the pulse, render the mind sluggish. Dvorak opened his eyes faintly at the sound of our voices. They came in silence, he whispered. No knock, no warning. I thought I dreamed it. Do you recall what they took? Holmes asked gently. My satchel, he replied. It contained only my notes, nothing of value. Value, Holmes repeated softly, is a word others define for us. A physician arrived, and we made our departure. Outside, I turned to Holmes. You believe this was an attempt at murder? No, he said. An act of control, to delay his movements, perhaps even to frighten him into compliance. Then we are no longer the only ones racing against time. Holmes gave a rare nod. Precisely. Someone wishes to bury the past before its roots can be named aloud. It was late that evening when Holmes resumed his place by the fire. The codex from Liska's shop opened once more across his knees. His expression was one of grim fascination. Watson, he said, we have been labouring under the belief that Dr. Stransky vanished for fear of persecution. But what if he vanished to protect something of greater weight than himself? You refer to the manuscript. To what it reveals, Holmes replied. The dates, the birth records, the cloistered signature, they converge upon a single name. A child of disputed parentage. A thread excised from the tapestry of royal succession. But surely no one would believe such a document after all these years. Holmes looked up. Belief, my dear Watson, is the first weapon of those who govern. A suggestion, especially when tied to lineage, is often enough to destabilize courts, to rewrite alliances, even to prompt assassination. And you believe this child's descendants live still? I believe someone does. Someone who would benefit, or be ruined, by the name now hidden in these pages. He closed the codex gently and tapped the spine with one finger. This is not a mere manuscript, it is a chalice filled with venom, and every man who has touched it has either disappeared or been marked for silence. And Dvorak? I asked. Holmes stared into the fire. Dvorak, he said quietly, knows more than he has spoken. The question is whether he is a guardian of truth, or its executioner. It was 3 days later, in the hallowed halls of the British Museum's Department of Manuscripts, that Holmes brought his plan into motion. I had grown familiar with his flair for theatrical strategies, of traps baited not with force, but with the subtle promise of revelation, and this, I saw at once, was to be one of his most elaborate. He had made arrangements through a contact in the Bodleian to schedule a small public reading, an examination of a newly discovered Bohemian manuscript, one which purported to bear striking genealogical claims concerning the House of Habsburg. The reading would be conducted in Latin, with translation and commentary to follow, and though the museum's scholars were intrigued, it was clear to me that the true purpose was not academic. "What are we baiting, Holmes?" I'd asked the night before. "A man, Watson," he replied. "Or rather, 2 men, and possibly a ghost." The invitation list was short, but strategic. Count Emil Dvorak was the first to confirm, ostensibly recovered from his illness. Mr. Anton Liska too reappeared, his manner unsteady, but his memory intact. Finally, a foreign attaché from the Austro-Hungarian embassy had been invited under the pretext of cross-border verification. Holmes ensured that each seat was arranged so as to allow him a view of every reaction, every flicker of anxiety. The manuscript itself, though beautiful in presentation, was, as Holmes admitted privately, an utter fabrication, or nearly. For all its deception, he told me quietly, one thread remains intact, one name, one date. That, Watson, is the match to the powder. As the clock struck 11, the appointed guests began to assemble in the narrow reading chamber, a high-ceilinged space whose solemn atmosphere did little to ease the tension that accumulated like dust upon the spines of forgotten kings. I took my place near the rear, as Holmes moved with deliberate calm to the head of the table. Count Dvorak entered with impeccable composure, his features now restored to the pale elegance he had worn on his first visit to Baker Street. Yet I noted something colder in him, an economy of gesture that bespoke inner calculation. He offered a stiff bow to Holmes and nodded toward Liska without a word. Liska, for his part, seemed a man aged beyond his years. Though dressed in formal attire, his hands trembled as he accepted a glass of water, and his eyes darted toward the exits twice before the reading began. Whether it was fear of betrayal or memory, I could not say. The third guest, Herr Kleiner, the embassy attaché, was a tall, hollow-cheeked man who listened intently yet refrained from comment. His presence, I understood, was not voluntary. He had come not to listen, but to assess. Holmes began the reading in his crisp Latin, translating passages of lineage and inheritance with fluid ease. The atmosphere remained taut, as though each word brushed the edge of an unspoken oath. At one point, Dvorak leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "This passage," he said, "is quite pointed." Holmes glanced up without pausing. "Indeed, Count, that is the nature of genealogies. They either illuminate or extinguish." From the corner, Liska exhaled audibly. Kleiner remained still, though his jaw tensed perceptibly. Holmes continued, and with each turn of the page, I felt the walls draw in. We were no longer in a reading room, but a theatre built for unmasking. During the brief recess that followed, I found Holmes in a side gallery, thumbing idly through a volume of Bohemian ballads. Yet his eyes were not upon the page. "You believe they took the bait?" I asked. He gave a faint smile. "More than that, Watson. They have taken the bait, and now quarrel over who shall carry it away without burning their hands." I looked down at the forged manuscript. It was all invented. Save for one line, a single annotation copied word for word from the true codex, the one smuggled from Brno. A detail so specific and so charged with implication that no true conspirator could ignore it. But why risk it? Because the truth cannot always be proven, but it can be provoked. They believe what they are reading is real, because it mirrors what they have already feared. And fear, my friend, compels men to act before they think. And if they discover it is false, they will not, Holmes said simply, not until the performance concludes. He closed the book gently. "Observe Dvorak when I speak the next name aloud. Watch Liska's hands, and listen, above all, to who does not speak." "And the attaché?" "A functionary," Holmes replied. "But he will carry word back to Vienna. That is essential." He turned, slipping the manuscript under his arm. "Come, Watson," he said. "The final scene begins, and the ghost we have hunted is about to knock on the door." The reading resumed after the interval, and the second half of the manuscript held more fire than parchment. Holmes's voice remained measured, yet in each syllable there was the weight of provocation. He spoke of a birth recorded in secret, of a convent ledger mysteriously expunged, and finally, deliberately, uttered the name that we both knew was neither invented nor widely known, Jakub Vondracek. The effect was instantaneous. Dvorak's fingers clenched the armrest. Liska's head jerked slightly. Kleiner sat like a man carved in salt. And then the lights flickered. I cannot say whether it was by design or ill-fated timing, but the gas lamps dimmed suddenly, casting the room into a half-shadow that seemed to thicken the air. In the hush that followed, a single sharp report rang out, a pistol fired at close quarters. The bullet struck the wall not 2 inches behind Dvorak's chair. Panic broke loose. One guest cried out. Liska fell back in his seat, clutching his chest, though unstruck. The attendants rushed to secure the exits. Holmes had already moved. "There," he said, pointing not toward the shooter, but toward the curtained alcove from which the flash had come. 2 guards pulled the curtain aside and revealed a figure in clerical robes, the gun still warm in his hand. "Do not shoot," the man said in a low voice. "I have fired my warning." He removed his hood and spectacles with calm fingers. It was Dr. Vaclav Stransky. The room froze, the silence broken only by the clatter of the weapon as Stransky surrendered it without resistance. I had not seen the man before, but Holmes, who had studied photographs in advance, gave a small nod of grim satisfaction. "It is you, then," Holmes said, "though it took more than disappearance to make yourself a ghost." Stransky looked weary rather than triumphant. His once bright eyes were now shadowed by exhaustion, and his beard had grown untidy. "It had to be this way," he said simply. "I needed them to believe I was gone, so I could see who would dare emerge from hiding." "You staged your own vanishing?" I asked in astonishment. "Yes," he replied, and left only enough trace to stir inquiry. I trusted Dvorak would turn to Holmes. He always admired his methods, even from afar. "And why the gunshot?" Holmes asked. "To draw the beast from cover. I had hoped to wound, not with the bullet, but with fear. It was never meant to kill." Liska, pale and trembling, found his voice at last. "Vaclav, you might have been murdered for your ruse." "I was already marked," Stransky said. "Once I deciphered the manuscript, I knew they would come. I only wanted the truth preserved. But I see now that truth cannot live in shadow. It needs light. It needs blood." He turned to Holmes. "The real document is destroyed. I burned it before I fled. What remains now are only pieces, fragments in men's minds." Holmes regarded him closely. "Then you knew Dvorak would not protect it?" Stransky's voice faltered. "He used to speak of ideals. Now he speaks only in caution and coded phrases. If he ever believed in the cause, he no longer does." Holmes nodded slowly. "And now, I fear, it is time to reveal what role he truly played." Holmes turned back to the gathering, his voice sharp but calm. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we must now move from theatre to tribunal. Count Dvorak, will you kindly stand?" Dvorak rose slowly, his composure still unbroken, though his eyes had narrowed to slits. "Is this some public accusation, Mr. Holmes?" "It need not be public," Holmes replied, "but I would prefer you hear the evidence before you attempt to deny it." Dvorak said nothing. "You have, since your arrival, attempted to control the flow of this narrative," Holmes continued. "You presented yourself as friend to the vanished man, while carefully omitting your own conflicting interests. You allowed a single clue to be found, the lion without a crown, yet made no mention of your prior knowledge of the symbol's true implications." "The image was real," Dvorak said coldly. "Stransky had drawn it." "Indeed, but it was you who placed it beneath his pillow, after he had gone into hiding." A murmur passed through the room. Holmes withdrew a handkerchief and unfolded it, revealing a pair of gloves. These were found among the Count's personal effects at the hotel. I had them examined. There are traces of a chemical ink used in Moravian presses, specifically from the same batch used in the forged codex. Dvorak's lips parted, but said nothing. You handled both the forgery and the real manuscript, Holmes said, and you brought them here under the guise of warning us against them. Why? Kleiner, the embassy attaché, spoke for the first time. Because he was never an exile. He is one of ours. Dvorak sighed and looked to Holmes. Then you have your answer. Holmes gave a curt nod. You are an agent of the Viennese secret police, sent to ensure the document's destruction before it could unsettle dynastic claims. Dvorak lowered his gaze. And now, it appears, I have failed. What followed was confusion, though not disorder. Museum officials quietly cleared the hall, and Holmes gave brief instructions to the authorities, who escorted Count Dvorak and Herr Kleiner to a private chamber under formal watch. Liska sat slumped in his chair, staring at nothing. Stransky, for his part, seemed curiously unburdened, as though the act of revealing had cost him his strength but returned his dignity. Only Holmes remained composed. I approached him as he gathered the forged manuscript from the lectern, but even as he did so, Liska stirred. No, the bookseller murmured. It should not survive, not even as fiction. Before we could stop him, he reached forward, seized the parchment, and thrust it into the flame of the reading lamp. It caught quickly. Within moments, the carefully forged codex curled into ash, releasing one final plume of smoke into the high vaulted ceiling. Holmes made no move to rescue it. I looked at him in dismay. That was your trap. No, he said. That was the bait. The trap has already sprung. What needed to be exposed has been exposed. The truth does not always require preservation on paper. Stransky approached the fire, watching the last embers vanish. So it ends, he said. No, Holmes replied quietly. It returns to silence. The silence where forgotten kings lie buried, not with ceremony, but with caution. We left the British Museum in twilight, the streets pale with fog. And though the manuscript was gone, its shadow lingered long after. We returned to Baker Street as the lamps along Marylebone Road flickered into life and a soft mist rolled from the east, folding itself around chimneys and iron railings like the memory of a vanished procession. Holmes made no remark during the cab ride, nor when we climbed the familiar stairs to our sitting room. He removed his overcoat with deliberate slowness and lit the fire, but I noted that he did not reach for his violin. The silence in the room was not one of idleness, but of a mind still sifting through the dust of a recently unearthed vault. I refrained from questioning him at once, knowing he would speak when the structure of his thought had reached its summit. When at last he seated himself with his long fingers steepled and his gaze fixed upon the flames, I ventured gently, "You were not surprised to see Stransky?" "Not surprised," he murmured. Relieved. The case demanded his reappearance. The logic of the pattern required the ghost to return. And Dvorak? Holmes exhaled slowly. An elegant villain. He played the part of ally convincingly, but too convincingly. He brought us a drama, with all the parts cast in advance. What he did not expect was that the final act would be rewritten by another hand. He turned to me then. The real story, Watson, was never about the theft of a manuscript or the disappearance of a man. It was about the staging of a truth too perilous to exist in daylight, and the competing ambitions of those who would either reveal it or erase it. I nodded slowly, and in the end, it was neither revealed nor erased, but smothered. Holmes gave a faint smile, as history so often is. Holmes stood and walked to the window, where he remained for some moments in stillness, observing the traffic and twilight below. Then, as if giving a lecture to no one but himself, he began to speak. Let us examine the sequence, Watson, now that the curtain has fallen. Stransky disappears, voluntarily. Why? Because he fears not for his life, but for what the document in his possession might provoke. He chooses to vanish and draw others out from their own concealments. And Count Dvorak, Dvorak seizes the opportunity. He steps into the role of concerned friend. He arrives at our door, not to illuminate the mystery, but to control it. He brings us just enough to suggest threat. An envelope, a name, a cryptic symbol. He draws the lion without its crown. The beast unseated, I murmured. Precisely. But why that image, and why now? Because it is a heraldic signal, one used only by those familiar with the Vltava circle. He intended it as bait, not for us, but for those watching from abroad. The embassy, the exiles, the surviving members of the circle. He knew that releasing a single thread would unravel the entire tapestry. Holmes turned from the window, but he miscalculated. Because of Stransky? I asked. No, Holmes replied. Because of Liska. The bookseller was not a man of action, but he was a man of memory. He recognized the watermark, the date, the Latin quotation, and he preserved the codex when all others would have destroyed it. That alone altered the shape of the plot. And what of the false manuscript? Holmes gave a small nod of admiration. A forgery, yes, but a forgery so close in detail that it lured Dvorak to expose himself. In hunting the bait, he revealed he already knew what was genuine. He returned to the fire. And thus, the crownless beast was never Stransky, he said, but the predator that came to devour him. I sat forward slightly, sensing that Holmes was now approaching the heart of the matter, not the mechanics of the case, but the philosophy that underpinned it. His face had grown solemn, and though he spoke evenly, there was in his voice a rare gravity. You asked once why men would kill for parchment and ink, Watson. The answer lies in what the ink reveals. Not just fact, but claim. The manuscript, had it survived and been authenticated, would have called into question the very legitimacy of the Habsburg succession. A secret heir? Precisely. The child noted in the records, Jakub von Dracek, was not merely a bastard. He was, according to the annotation in the original manuscript, born of a union that, if recognized, would place him ahead of several extant lines of inheritance. The legitimacy of half a continent's alliances would have wobbled on its hinges. And yet no one can prove it now, I said. Holmes inclined his head. The manuscript is gone, but its existence, however fragmentary, will continue to haunt those who knew of it. That is why Dvorak's mission was to destroy not only the document, but those who could remember it. First Stransky, then Liska, and had we not intervened, perhaps even you and I. I felt a chill I could not entirely attribute to the hour. But what now? I asked. Does the truth simply vanish into rumour? It becomes myth, Holmes said quietly, and myth, as you know, has a longer life than truth. He sat down once more, his long fingers returning to their usual pose of meditation. There are certain truths, Watson, which mankind can neither wield nor discard. They must be buried, not to protect the guilty, but to preserve the delicate fictions by which civilization holds itself upright. He looked at me, and in his expression there was neither triumph nor regret, only understanding. And so, he said, we close the book, not because it is false, but because the world is not prepared to read it. Holmes was in no hurry to speak further that evening, but I could see from the glint in his eyes and the taut repose of his hands that his mind had not yet abandoned the theatre of the case. It was past midnight when he finally broke the stillness. There is something poetic, Watson, he said, in the notion that a man might feign his own disappearance not to escape justice, but to summon it. You refer to Stransky. Indeed, he understood that mere accusations would not suffice, not against a man as subtle as Dvorak. He required the construction of a play in which the villain would believe himself safe until the final act. But why trust us? Because Dvorak's arrogance required a stage, and because Stransky understood I would see through the misdirection eventually, though I confess I arrived at it only after observing his hesitations in the museum alcove. Holmes reached into his drawer and removed the torn drawing of the lion without its crown. He smoothed it on the table. This, Watson, was the first signal, placed not by Stransky, but by Dvorak. A heraldic signature meant to suggest rebellion and danger, but look closer. The lines are too precise, the ink too fresh. It was not warning, but invitation, cleverly cloaked. And the gloves? A mistake. He handled the forgery and then carelessly removed the gloves without cleansing them. A man trained in espionage rarely errs in ink, but Dvorak believed he was working among amateurs. Holmes tapped the edge of the drawing. Stransky, by contrast, disappeared so thoroughly that even his enemies began to forget his face. He resurfaced not to reclaim the truth, but to force a falsehood into collapse. He leaned back. A victory, yes, but a silent one. The truth is lost, the manuscript burned, and those who survived will not speak again. Yet a ghost was dragged into the light, and the lion roared once more. I remember leaning forward and speaking in a voice more troubled than I intended. And yet the truth, whatever it was, remains buried. Holmes did not immediately respond. He reached for the tobacco jar, filled his pipe, and struck a match. The flare illuminated his features briefly before settling into a dull orange glow. There are truths, he said slowly, which the world cannot digest whole. Like unripe fruit, they must either be discarded or softened by time. But surely justice requires disclosure. Justice, Holmes murmured, is not a creature of absolutes. It is not a sword, nor even a scale. It is a veil. It adapts. In some cases, revelation is the very root of injustice. I protested. But Dvorak, he acted with deceit and menace. Should that go unpunished? Punishment has many forms, my dear fellow. Exposure is one, exile another. The man has lost his position, his protection, and his mission. He will be recalled to Vienna in disgrace, if not quietly buried by the very agency he served. Holmes exhaled a slow curl of smoke. As for Stransky, he survives. But he has sacrificed his cause. In drawing the traitor out, he has forfeited the very secrecy that gave his work power. He turned his gaze to the fire. You see, Watson, we live in a world so delicately balanced that certain truths can topple it. Monarchs are upheld not only by lineage, but by belief. Nations exist not on maps, but in minds. To unmake one with a manuscript would be a cruelty disguised as correction. I was silent for a while. And what of us? Holmes smiled faintly. We are the custodians of untold things. That is our burden. We know the lion's name, but we shall never speak it. Outside, the city murmured in its sleep, unaware of the war that had been fought and forgotten in a single breath. It is in the quiet hours, when the day has folded and my pen lies idle, that I most often reflect upon the cases which did not end in gavel or grave. This was such a one. The law, it seemed to me, had neither triumphed nor failed, but merely stepped aside. Dvorak would not stand in a dock. No jury would hear Liska's trembling testimony, and yet justice, if it existed, had found its way, not as a thunderclap, but as a whisper. I could not help but think of Stransky, alone now, a man without homeland or brotherhood. Though he had emerged from hiding, he would never truly return. Some exiles, I have come to understand, are not measured in distance, but in memory. He would carry his cause not in a banner, but in a scar. And Holmes, what of him? There are times when I sense in him a fatigue, not born of age, but of understanding. He sees further than most, into the murk that lies behind reason, the intentions that hide behind governments and gestures. And having seen so much, he must choose daily what to say and what to leave unsaid. That is a heavy duty for any man. As for myself, I have recorded this account not for acclaim, nor even for preservation, but as a kind of confession. There are truths I shall never publish, but this one though dimmed and disguised, deserved to be written, if only so I might remember that not all battles are fought with bayonets, and not all victories shine. Some weeks later, as Holmes and I walked through Regent's Park in the dusk, he remarked with uncharacteristic softness, "There are more wars fought in silence, Watson, than ever reach the battlefield." I thought of Dvorak's polished words, Liska's trembling hands, Stransky's fading voice, and the codex, now ash, that once threatened to unsettle thrones. "How many more come to London?" I asked, carrying secrets folded in their coats, ghosts in the guise of diplomats, rebels dressed as scholars. Holmes smiled. "More than we know, and more than we ever will." "And what are we to them?" He looked out toward the pond, where swans moved like phantoms on black glass. "Sometimes witnesses," he said, "sometimes saboteurs, and sometimes just men with a lamp, trying to read a letter that was never meant to be opened." That night, I found myself thinking of all who passed through Baker Street, men of power, of guilt, of fear, and how often their visit leaves behind no trace, save for a glance exchanged over tobacco smoke, or the single word Holmes will mutter days later, long after the case has closed. Curious. Indeed it was. And so I end this account with a question not of proof or deduction, but of possibility. How many other visitors from Prague walk unnoticed among us, carrying truths sharp enough to change empires, yet content to vanish into London's fog? As we stepped out into the mist-laced morning, Holmes paused beneath the iron arch of Baker Street, hands behind his back, gaze distant. "You see, Watson," he said, "truth is not always the sword we imagine it to be. Sometimes it is a mirror, one so finely polished that those who fear their own reflection will go to astonishing lengths to shatter it." He turned toward me then, his expression unreadable. Dvorak believed the world safer with the past in ashes. Stransky believed it nobler with the truth unveiled, and in the end, both were undone by what they cherished most. "And what of the truth itself?" I asked. Holmes lit a match, shielding it from the wind. "Truth remains, Watson. It merely chooses quieter rooms to speak in. What do you believe was Dvorak's greatest error? Trusting his disguise, underestimating Stransky, or thinking Holmes would play the part he'd written for him? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if this mystery stirred your imagination, be sure to subscribe for more cases from the shadows of Baker Street. Share it with those who still believe some secrets are worth the chase.